It wasn't until I started graduate school that I realized I had traded important pieces of myself to be successful. I was sitting across from one of my professors talking in her office. She wanted to know how things were going as I wrapped up my first year. I told her, honestly, I'm struggling. I told her I noticed how each of my professors treated me as if I had done something wrong in class. She laughed. So I told her I noticed I had been snapped at for participating in discussions, and when I wasn't being ridiculed, I was blatantly ignored when I raised my hand. I told her I noticed a look of disgust on my professors' faces when I was finally given permission to engage. She said, "Not me though, right?" And then she laughed. So I told her of personal struggles. I told her I was unsure if my family was safe or if my mother would pass away, or if I can manage this new level of depression that had seemingly set in since I began school here. I told her of struggles with my supervisor. I told her I couldn't be myself in this program without being treated like a violent criminal, and I couldn't sit quiet or disengaged like the other white students in class without being accused of slacking off. And again, she laughed. And at this point, I could feel the stinging in my eyes as tears began to form, and I remember clutching my coat, hoping it would cover up the anger and embarrassment I was feeling. And then it hit me. She had not heard me. She had not heard me because she had not allowed the context in which I was speaking to inform the way she listened. First-generation student from Chicago, Black and male. She saw no reason for empathy, concern, or seriousness in my response. She saw just another graduate student who was perhaps struggling in graduate school. Raise your hand if you can see me right now. Go ahead, raise them high like you mean it. Ironically enough, it's in settings like this where I feel the least visible. Look around the room. Look at the people sitting next to you, around you. Now return your attention to me. How many of you noticed that I'm one of the few non-white bodies in this room? Now, I know some of you may buy into the philosophy that I don't see color, or that you treat everybody equally. But by ignoring the fact that I'm Black, are you not ignoring my entire body on this stage, rendering me invisible, as if I was just the clothes standing up here in front of you? This is what my professor had done, as she failed to catch the cues from my context, every cue that there was a unique need that she needed to hear. This is what I had done to myself by relying on a veil of whiteness for acceptance while trying to express my struggles as a Black man. See, in higher education, there are a number of disparities that people with non-white bodies face every day. For me, it was often act white or fail. Code switching became a way to live on both sides of that duality. But it's not just me. At Iowa State, according to Dr. Craig Ogilvy's survey, graduate students of color are discriminated against based on physical characteristics, verbally harassed based on physical characteristics, devaluation of their ideas in discussion based on physical characteristics, and devaluation of their academic work based on physical characteristics. And on top of all of that, they are physically and verbally threatened. All of that 50% more likely than other students. That is to say, here at this school, graduate students of color are made to feel dumb, devalued, put down, and threatened at 50% higher rates than every other student. 50%. But it isn't just graduate students, and it's not just this school. Dr. Sean Harper, top Black male scholar and outgoing president of the Association for the Study of Higher Education, in 2015, he noted, numerous scholars have called attention to the underrepresentation, social isolation, academic hurdles, cultural incongruence, and racism that Black students face on predominantly white campuses. Yet even further back, W.E.B. Du Bois describes a response to this kind of disparity. He says, it is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at yourself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world who looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro. Two thoughts, two souls, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body. Now, I know two heads might be better than one, but when they inhabit the same dark body, problems arise. Enter code switching. Code switching is the brief and systematic alteration of the way one speaks or behaves to fit in better. For me, code switching was a euphemism for acting more white when my life or success was on the line, and then being black when the stakes were not as high. I remember my first experience with my othering, my two-ness. Young black boy from Chicago. Though it's not the war zone the media would paint it to be, it's just a city with its problems. Problems like the police harassing me on my way home from school because I fit the generic description of a black teenager. Problems like attending an underfunded school that consistently lost its funding every year. Higher education was supposed to be my way out, the golden ticket that no one in my family had received before. And it's because I grew up having to believe that somehow being more educated would somehow make me more equal to white people in this country, that I understand the desire to hold on to equality. I understand why we would hold on to it so tightly that it would become the best practice way not to be racist. Because if you treat everyone the same, race doesn't matter. You can't discriminate, you can't be prejudiced, and you can't systematically participate in the oppression of someone else for your benefit. Are we so romantically infatuated with the idea of equality that we would ignore the pile of bodies on stage? I would argue that we are, because no one is listening to the problems of students with non-white bodies. And as I said, education was supposed to be my way out. Yet imagine my surprise when I walked into university offices and no one would help me. Imagine my surprise when I walked into the university bookstore and I was followed around as if I would steal something. Imagine the horror of being denied access to a building that I worked in and said the building was for students. Imagine having to prove I was a student multiple times just for being on university property. Imagine thinking you got a whole campus to broaden your future and your horizons. Instead, you find yourself in a tiny office in the basement of an old building where the diversity office is located, being the only place you feel welcomed. Now, I knew from my unwarranted yet ritual chats with Chicago Police Department that if I acted less like the stereotype they viewed me as when we encountered each other, I would be treated differently. And so naturally, I adopted this strategy when I got to college. So I spoke less like student and more like faculty who had mastered the articulation of the academy. I stopped dressing like a student and more like important businessman. And shamefully, in moments, I pretended that race didn't exist. Code switching has some equivalent exchange. See, for my success in white spaces and in college, I was given black jokes, microaggressions, and other forms of subtle racism. Code switching became harmful, a tumble to cultural suicide even, a term coined by former president of the Association for the Study of Higher Education, Dr. William Tierney. And essentially, cultural suicide is sacrificing your cultural identity so that you can assimilate. I believe some can commit a sacrifice so bad that we can seldom recover. Now, the evolution from brief and systematic changes to a full-on identity sacrifice comes from repeatedly internalizing this racism. Luckily for me, I had outlets that would keep me from this sacrifice. I had my sister, who encouraged me in ways that only a Black woman could. I had my fraternity brothers. I had my mentors, Dr. Michael Hill, Armando Duarte, Dr. Malik Henfield in undergrad. And in grad school, I had my fellow students of color, who I lean on to this day. And even with all these cultural outlets keeping me from the sunken place of cultural suicide, it wasn't until talking to my current advisor that I realized the duality that mattered outside of my own head. Dialogue. My advisor called me one summer day after my first year in graduate school to tell me two pieces of bad news. One, my advisor at the time was leaving, and two, I was in danger of getting kicked out of the program. Now, we spoke briefly about some formalities at first, and then we paused, and he said, "Tell me about your experience." I asked him why. He said, so that he could help. I responded, "I'll tell you, but you have to understand where I'm coming from." A cue that he would have to understand the context of my words and not the meaning he sought to derive from them. He would have to listen to understand and not to respond. Needless to say, I was not kicked out of the program, and my advisor has gone on to support my grant applications and help me put together post-graduation plans. But it all started with him seeing me, listening to me for who I am and what I bring. And then we were able to share dialogue. Dialogue is important because it allows us to stop letting the bodies on stage screaming out that they matter be the solution. It allows us to stop letting people sacrifice their cultural identity to fit in. No longer can we allow people to pile their cultural bodies on stage. We cannot let them code switch anymore. Instead, as a community, we must share this responsibility and code break. To code break, people with non-white bodies in higher education must be given the opportunity to show up authentically ourselves. This is essential for letting us to tell our story. Can we allow the person telling the story to be the expert in their experience? Can we allow for someone else who is different than us to share who they are? In our shared responsibility, can we break this code that allows us to put our own biases in front of someone else's humanity? Now, I know that's a lot to take in, so I'll break it down to 3 easy steps. To code break, check for shared meaning of the story. Ask, is this what you meant when you said, or I heard you say this, and allow them to confirm or edit your understanding. Step number 2, allow the storyteller to be the expert in their own experience. Affirm their story. Believe them. And lastly, probably the most difficult step of all, accept non-closure. You may need more than a single conversation, or you may need to do some research about the context before you can fully understand where that individual is coming from. I think about my professor who was incapable of hearing my real-life experiences, laughing at my real stories. And I ask you, will you continue to ignore the pile of cultural bodies on stage? Or will you choose to see the humanity of those you so desperately desire to treat equally?